Okay, here we go.
Thank you. Thank you. Evening, everyone. And thanks for your patience. We are kicking off our season with a hybrid event. So there's obviously a few challenges there, but we got a great evening lined up for you tonight. Not only is John Cutler here with us to discuss placing bets in an uncertain time, but we're also kicking off our season. Oops. It is the official start of our 2022-23 season kickoff, and we have a lot of exciting things planned. So we'll take a couple of minutes. I'll be really quick on this. We get to the main event. Just want to introduce you to the board if you haven't met them. Say hi. We're very friendly people. My name is Rena. I'm the president. We have Heidi Ram, our secretary. Adam, for those of you who are here, have met him. He is our treasurer and events. Rhythm is membership and content. Victor, it leads our volunteer community. Nathan leads our mentorship program, and Rena is an officer on the board. But more importantly, we have a host of volunteers who are going to help make this year and our subsequent years really, really exciting. So first, I want to call out that without our volunteer community, we wouldn't have our new brand, we wouldn't have our new website, we wouldn't have the start of some exciting new programs, which I'm not going to talk about today, but will be kind of talked about through the course of the next few events and whatnot. So without our volunteers as a not-for-profit, we wouldn't get much done. So thank you to our volunteers. You're crucial to our operations. And thank you, of course, to our sponsors. We have many of them who help make this product community thrive and grow. And we appreciate all of our sponsor support. Really quickly, mentorship program for those of you who haven't been involved in the mentorship program before, and for those of you who have, registration is open today. So registration is open from the 27th to the 22nd. There's information on our website. It's a great opportunity to be paired up with a mentor or with a mentee and do one-on-one mentorship for the course of 6 months. It's a really great program. Check it out. Don't miss registration. Ends November 22nd. All right. So that said I was going to be really, really fast. And now I'm going to hand it over to Adam for tonight's event.
Thank you so much, Rena. And thank you, everybody that's joined us here and has joined us online. And as Rena mentioned, little technical chop trying to get this all together. So I'm going to settle in here for a second. I am very pleased to be speaking with John Cutler and to learn together this evening as a community with him. Brendan, can we bring John up?
Sorry, that sounded funny.
Yeah. So John,
could have used the telepresence. Just kidding.
In my preparations, I forgot to bring your bio up, John. So I'm going to ad lib a little bit here. I was listening to a podcast that you were on earlier from a few years back, and you were talking about the coherence police because you're so prolific, and people are saying, wait, but it's not consistent with what he said a year or two ago. And one of the things that's really amazed me about John, trying to learn a little bit about him in preparation for this conversation, is that he is an immensely prolific writer. He's written on so many different areas of strategy, not strategy, product management. I very frequently look at the pragmatic marketing charts, really good one between strategy and tactics and the grid, and to my APMs and everything else. And so much of John's writing covers the map, which makes him, I think, an extremely well qualified product evangelist. And it's an honor to have you with us here tonight, John.
Yep, my pleasure. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Can I just note that the podium says Q4, which is going to probably cause people a fair amount of anxiety. Sorry. It's coming. It's coming. It's just a couple days away. Q3 has been great. Never mind. Okay. Keep going.
Okay. Hold on one second. I can turn this one around. Yes. So we are in Q4 Incorporated's space. Thank you, Q4, our space sponsor.
Nice. Thank you.
Yes. So John, we wanted to talk a bit about placing bets in uncertain times, but before we get there, you have talked about so many different product strategies. Tell us a bit about your product evangelism and how it suits you.
Yeah, so I lucked into a very unique role at Amplitude. This was about 4 years ago. And someone had been following my writing who worked at Amplitude and said that they were forming this new role. It's not exactly like developer relations. It wasn't going to involve talking about the product every day. And it was consistent with my writing at the time. I made this post called, how do you know you're working in a feature factory? Obviously, Amplitude wanted to help people not work in a feature factory. And so they got in touch with me and I interviewed for this role. And I lucked into this role that allowed me to sort of be a professional product nerd for one particular company as a full-time employee. I have a team and I'm a part of a team. I have a manager, I'm a full-time employee. But my role is predominantly meeting with companies from around the world. So maybe in some weeks I might meet with 15 or 20 different companies. And so since that time, the last 4 years, it's very much my awareness of the product space has kind of blossomed, and I write a lot about it. And so it works really well for Amplitude. It works well for me. Yeah, and it's a super interesting role. I don't know if your companies have a product evangelist, but if you don't, you should consider it. It's kind of a unique it's a little meta though, because it's a product evangelist in the product space. So it's like a product evangelist, which is a little weirder, but you get the idea. So
maybe help ground us a little bit. So I've largely worked at startups. I don't think any of those organizations would quite be at the size where a product evangelist would be suited. Like what size organization is going to have a product evangelist?
I started at Amplitude when it was about 150. And so our, the product team itself was 40, 50 at the time, maybe 60. But I think a lot of companies have maybe more of like a developer relations role. It's actually an interesting idea because there is a niche that needs to be filled with specialized products that it's actually unfair to ask your sales folks to fill. In the sense that, if you're, especially among product people, we're really snarky, we're really skeptical of salespeople. We just want someone to tell us about the product. And so our poor sales folks in Amplitude, they need help for this type of stuff. So you basically you're filling that niche for specialized, practice-centric, experienced advice, consultative advice. And so that becomes like a nice balance. So if your company has that type of challenge where your ecosystem is specialized, maybe people are resistant to normally talking to a salesperson. They just want to try the product, yet there's information that they need to understand. And then they seek education about the broader landscape of the market, not just product analytics, but all of product, for example. It might be a good idea for your company. Yeah, happy to chat about that too. So it's an interesting role.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for digging in on that a bit. So switching gears just a little bit and learning a bit more about you. What would you describe as your product superpowers?
Oh, my product superpowers. So it's probably in line with systems thinking. I have this blog, this Substack called The Beautiful Mess. Unraveling these kind of complex either ecosystems from a product perspective or how companies work or how teams work is probably the thing I've spent the most amount of time thinking about. I certainly don't think it's a superpower because every time you think you've figured it out, you realize you haven't truly figured it out. But I think so that overlaps things like product strategy, organizational structure, things like product ops, things like career tracking, et cetera, and these things. And then I also wrote some playbooks for Amplitude. One was called the North Star Playbook. And so that's been like an MBA because I've ended up understanding how, 180 or 200 companies work by doing workshops to them about their product strategy. So I've probably developed a fair amount of product strategy chops in the last couple of years that I didn't necessarily have before. That's a pretty rare thing, if you work, hopefully none of you will have like 50 jobs in your life, But imagine if you had 4 times that and you learned about each product strategy, you know, so it's certainly like you learn a lot that way for sure.
Yeah, management consulting for product management, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe.
So then turning a bit to the subject for the evening around uncertain times, what I'd like to do is ask you a few questions around kind of macro environment, macro economics. So, you know, if you were to take some broad strokes and describe the macroeconomic climate, how might you slice up the last 10 years?
Oh, the last 10 years, that's good. Abundant capital pandemic, not abundant capital pandemic. At the highest level. No, but listen, being at Amplitude during, let's just take a little slice of that during the pandemic. That was just an incredible eye opener. You saw some companies that literally tripled their business in a matter of 3 months, and other companies that lost 90% of their business in 3 months. So that was just to take a little slice of that. You know, I lucked into working in an analytics company during that particular time. But it's been fascinating these last couple of years, because I would argue that the companies that met headwinds and hardships in the midst of the pandemic were actually uniquely prepared for the time we are experiencing in the last 6 to 12 months. The companies that have the hardest time with the correction in the market at the moment were ones that were flying so insanely high during the pandemic. And they actually talked themselves into superpowers that they didn't necessarily have. Like, we can predict the future. Everything is up and to the right. We can do no wrong. All the bets we place are like that. Let's just acquire a couple more companies. It's all going to be amazing. And those companies are having an especially hard time now. So we could talk about the whole 10 years, but I've just noticed in these last 3 years, anytime you think you're on a roll on a team, you might be getting ahead of your skis. And then anytime you're met with adversity, it obviously seems like the hardest possible time you could face, but it could be the seeds for your success in the future. And these types of lessons have been repeated, just even going back and meeting teams every year for the past 4 years as part of my normal role at Amplitude. That's been pretty visible at the moment. So yeah, we could go into the macroeconomic things, but I do think like abundant capital pandemic and like not abundant capital is probably a good way to slice it up. But one thing, to go back to the Amplitude example, any generalization is just that, because seeing how different segments responded. I'll give you an example. I was on a call with a customer of ours that's a Norwegian labor office. Crazy, they use product analytics or whatever. And this person said, I've been trying to advocate for DevOps practices for the last 10 years and nothing had happened. I mean, something had happened. They'd kind of made some progress, but nothing had truly unlocked the value of their work. And this was early in the pandemic. They said that the most amazing thing happened last week. There was a lawyer, a designer, and a developer on a call shipping software while the ink was being signed for a law. And it was basically as if, I call it like discontinuous improvement, in the sense that we think that improvement is continuous, but it's actually pretty discontinuous, in the sense that this leader had been working for 10 years, laying all the seeds for this thing. And you don't know when the seeds will bear fruit to do this, but it would happen to take this pandemic and this terrible situation to have them take a massive step change in terms of how they're operating as a team. And now I can, maybe share the link afterwards. If you follow Nav, which is the name of this place, on LinkedIn, they're like, oh, we're shipping 1,000 times a week. We are handling 80% of the money of Norway. It's really, really, really amazing. So I just wanted to add that too. You can't generalize in this situation, and some like really amazing things happen amidst things being pretty terrible at the same time.
Yeah, and like right sizing the organization and the right staff for the right problems kind of takes me where I wanted to go next with this, which is, so we have a broad audience in the community here. We've got a number of product executives, managers and a whole bunch of people at various levels of entry and intermediate. And so as we're talking about these, abundant capital, pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, could you help maybe, what are the slices as you go from that macro and economic circumstance down a couple levels, and where some of the problem spaces are for product managers, either at the executive level or the kind of manager level and down?
Yeah, so I think you alluded to one, which is basically pacing. So the current environment basically threw the pacing and expectations off kilter. So that would be the pacing, like the growth of the organization, the hiring growth. Well, I think one thing that if you're an executive and you've been doing this for a while, you'll know exactly what I mean. But for the benefit of the more junior folks here, from your perspective, you might be looking at the board and looking at the CEO and looking at what's happening there and imagining this just sort of, oh my God, can't they make up their mind? I mean, this is going nowhere. Where's the strategy? Where is the direction? Now, any of the executives in the room know exactly what these conversations are like on the other side, which is we can gamble now and maybe have to let go of 30% of the staff in a couple months, or and maybe be okay. Or we can take some sort of hit in the expectations that we tell the market or tell our particular investors. And so the perception from the outside is this sort of like a failure of strategy, seize the strategy during uncertain times. The reality on the ground is that most of the strategic assumptions in, let's say, a startup or thing are timing assumptions. Where is the market going to be? How far is certain technologies going to evolve? Where are we going to see bundling? Where are we going to see unbundling? How long is it going to take things to happen? It's not if it's going to happen, because you sort of generally know that certain things will happen. It's the pace that they're going to happen. So what I would say, and without going too deep into it, is the number one challenge you're seeing on the ground at the moment are recalibrating to certain levels of pace and trying to figure out what that's going to mean for the organization. And it's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult. Plus, there's a lot of sort of social factors to this as well. Anyone who found themselves completely burnt out in the last year and switching jobs knows exactly what I mean. That in addition to the companies as organisms, like we're humans and we have our own cycles of these things as well. So I was talking to a leader just recently, and they're like, I'm pretty sure that 50% of my team is rather checked out rightfully, and 30% are hanging on with heroics, but they're going to be pretty checked out and burnt out in a bit. I have no idea what to do. And so I think these are the realities on the ground at the moment that folks might not see, but this is, I'm not sure it directly answered your question, but the number one factor at the moment is to think about how to recalibrate assumptions around pacing and timing from a strategic perspective. And that's what's being thrown for a loop at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. Where in that world of abundant capital, it was growth. And now you see the pendulum swing, value,
right.
And growth is getting punished.
Yeah.
So, as you're looking forward, then as you're thinking about the next couple quarters, and maybe we'll get inflation under control, maybe we'll avoid a recession, what have you, how do you see software companies faring? I think Deloitte's saying that of all the companies, SaaS companies, those that invested in telework and so forth, stand to be kind of middling. Some will get punished, some will get rewarded, but by and large, the audience here, product managers working at these kind of companies, may fare all right. How do you see software companies coming through the next couple quarters?
Well, I know enough not to predict the future anymore. But well, one thing, let me just explain what I observe in talking with teams, and then that will indirectly answer the question, is that you definitely see some companies benefiting in a sense, in this weird roundabout way, of a bit of pressure being taken off from the company. And then there's discussions about how to create more of an engine around kind of a sustainable, disciplined approach to growth and the decisions they're making. So I imagine some companies will fare well because, imagine if you're like, you were just funded at a certain amount and then sort of things have been reset and in some ways, the expectations even from investors are kind of realigned and the discussions change. So I think that there is a portion of SaaS companies that are going to actually develop the habits they need in the next year or two to be massively successful, because it kind of swings into like periods of abundance and then gluttony. And then what happens after gluttony? You either go away or you go back into scarcity and ingenuity. And so I tend to think that there's a pendulum that swings between abundance and gluttony, and then scarcity and ingenuity. Now, there is a form of abundance where you're not too ahead of your skis, where you're not too gluttonous, you're not taking too much for granted, but we really see a pendulum swing back there. So I think that overall, the answer to your question about how certain companies will fare is, what learning do they take to heart about what it means to operate in conditions of scarcity, and then their ability to leverage that as these years progress. And it seems kind of theoretical, but it's not, because these conversations with leaders will be like, you know, like they're actually feeling a little less pressure for some things for growth, but more pressure for insights, more pressure for understanding their ideal customer profiles. So you can imagine a company that's just in a period of abundance. Oh, we don't really care who's buying our product. They're all buying it. It's amazing. They're all buying it. Now it really, really matters, because you know what? 50% of your revenue is coming from crypto companies that have just like are nothing now, right? So that attention to detail, the attention on the customer profiles you deal with, the attention to what does it really mean to renew? What does it really mean to have a customer that just is kind of just phoning in their renewals versus one that will become like a highlight customer for you? I think that pressure is going to create an environment for the discipline for some companies to be super successful. And that's just my particular take from talking to leaders.
Awesome. Thank you for kind of helping set the stage here. So with some of that background on the current state of markets and companies, you know, how some are faring, I'd like to kind of get into a bit more detail on these uncertain times. And so your take on a stereotypical product management scenario made me laugh, which is folks want to walk into the room with the output. Their goal is to write a roadmap, right? We've all heard it. Where's my roadmap, right? I'm ready, you know, I need something to sell. Give me a roadmap. So, you know, from your perspective, like, how does this really go? Walk us through this process of getting to that right direction.
Cool. I think I understand the question. Let's talk about, getting to the point of maybe, so would one tack here be like, what is the process to create the right roadmap with that type of pressure? Would that be a good direction to take?
Yeah, and perhaps as you're thinking about it now with so much uncertainty, right? Like,
oh, right.
There's a bunch of prediction, but as you said, like forecasting the future is very intrepid territory. So, and yet we still need to bring the right things to market.
Yeah, and I think that this is one of the things, is that in times of uncertainty, I'll offer this observation to start. In times of uncertainty, who on the team does not want a sense of certainty? So I'll give you the example. I was speaking to a company the other day, and a product leader is saying, look, you know, the sales people just want a vision. They just want a product strategy they can believe in. And they felt under incredible pressure for certainty because conditions are so uncertain. So one of the at least observations talking to leaders is the people who are doing the best here are those who are able to communicate about uncertainty with certainty. And what I mean is that you could imagine a pendulum. So on one side, it's like you communicate about certainty, but it's certainty theater, and everyone can see through it in 2 seconds. Like, oh my God, they're bullshitting us. Like, there's no way that it's like that. And on the other end of the spectrum is the person who walks into the room and they're saying, uncertain times, everyone, uncertain times. It's uncertain times. That other one does not, the latter does not inspire confidence, and then the former does not inspire confidence. So what I would say is that there is a certain technique, I think, about communicating realistically with your team while also presenting a very crisp diagnosis and at least a way forward. So for example, I would see like a roadmap as potentially the output of a diagnosis, and like, here's our current trajectory that you're taking. Certain strategies are like this. So I think that the difference goes down to, and then maybe we'll get to deeper parts of the question. I think that what everyone needs to keep in mind is it is okay to have a perspective in uncertain times. It's okay to frame a diagnosis of the situation. It's okay to offer up some potential counter diagnoses of the situation and lay out at least a direction, but acclimate your team to the idea that there's a potential that this will change and making your assumptions clear. So very specifically, it might be something like, right now we are seeing a lot of headwinds with this certain customer profile that we have. You know, what we thought was product market fit is kind of come a little bit into question. So we've lost a little bit of that. You know, the first half of next year will be about reestablishing our core and learning more about what was it with that segment of customers that was really getting them attached to the product. And then that will dictate our strategy for the next half of the year. Here are some tangible learning milestones that we hope to reach. We're going to present this report to you on those segment of customers by May. We'll have some numbers from the first quarter that will kind of bear out what's going on there. And then this other thing. So sorry, I didn't like plan that ahead or anything. So it probably seemed like a contrived example, but that is a method of communicating about uncertainty with certainty and at least a crisp diagnosis, and then demonstrating leadership in that area to do that. So I'll pause to see if that springs up any other questions, but I think that the number one challenge is how not to fall into certainty theater, and then also how not to fall into a very demoralizing analysis paralysis spiral that the whole company just believes there's just no way forward for that. And that I think is the ultimate challenge.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. And then we'll all have different personalities that we're trying to communicate that to. And so what the reaction that comes back as, you know, more evidence or yes,
Right.
you know, like
more evidence for what they don't want to do. And then the things they want to do, they don't really need a lot of evidence. So you need to be prepared for that too.
Thank you. You've brought me exactly what I want to hear. We're ready.
We're ready. This is exactly what we wanted.
It's my favorite answer. You know, we're talking organizations are very bespoke. Product organizations kind of evolve. They'll have chapters in their maturation of a entrepreneurial startup and scale up and what have you. And you were describing a bit about the way that you work with organizations and help kind of categorize their work. And you're trying to help set them up for that right shape at a particular moment in time. Tell us a bit about how this method works and how does it play out?
Yeah, that's you know, so if you read, there was that Ryan Singer book for Basecamp that talks about the shape of bets. That certainly, he had a really interesting idea of that, but I think more broadly that idea of the shape of the work has been around for a long time. And what I like to think about is that you're really making like a portfolio of bets. And this portfolio of bets ranges in things like the certainty around the opportunity, the size of the opportunity, the certainty around the size of the opportunity. Like, is this experimentation friendly? Is it not? Is the solution space known to us or is it not? Are we reaching a local maximum and need to bust through that? Or are we on that part of the curve where most anything you can do can create an improvement? And so I think what can be very, very helpful for teams is just think about the bets that you're placing as a portfolio. And then as we see during this particular shift in the economy, you might shift that portfolio up a little bit. And this is where I think ideas like, Kano model is helpful. So the idea you're going to have delighters and you're going to have these performance things. I think all those models are helpful. What they don't capture is risk. They don't capture the shape of risk for these bets. Like, is the risk in the opportunity size? Is the risk in your ability to create a solution? Is the risk in the experimentation friendliness of it? Or is the risk in the execution of a large fixed amount of work that only you'll get value at the end of it? And so I think an activity that I actually do with teams, I've been doing it now for 6 months at least, is we could use other models, but I just help a team come up with their own model that at least allows them to put words to this. And so I'll ask them a question, what information will you need about the work to eventually make great decisions? Now, you note I said eventually make great decisions, not what must you know about the work right now before you do anything about it, not you must pass all these checkbox items before you get to the next stage of the work. Mostly like, what will you need to know about this to make great decisions? Example, if you're a UX researcher and someone proposes work for a persona that you've never worked with before, that might be a line item for you. Persona worked with before or not? Let's say that you're a developer and there's really a question about, are you leveraging existing technologies you're using? Or are you fundamentally shifting maybe the data model, or are you fundamentally using new technologies? So when you do this activity, what's incredible is that what starts out is like a low effort, high value, low value. When you actually do this activity with the team, you find they'll come up with 20 or 30 of these sliders almost. Like, this is how the people on your team are going to shift their working strategy, depending on the nature of the work. Some of the big ones are, like I mentioned, like opportunity size and opportunity confidence, et cetera. So one thing you could do with your team right away to address this is sit down, pose that question to the team. What must we eventually know about this bet or work to make great decisions? From that, create a structure that you can help in your language of your company to describe the bets that you have. And then from there, that allows you to create a portfolio of bets. So you can look at your bets and say, well, we're pretty heavy on the small optimizers now, and we're not planting the seeds for 2 years from now when we'll need some kind of step change in terms of innovation. So long answer for that, but I could, if anyone's interested, you could reach out on LinkedIn. I could give you some of the posts I've written about these sort of like bet categorization schemes, but ultimately you want to balance your portfolio of risk in a way that makes sense for the team.
So maybe digging in just slightly more on tuning these bets. What kind of added signals are you looking for? Are you looking for validation in market? Are you looking for more, primary research? What's your method for like pursuing that information and kind of whittling down the list?
Yeah. So this perfect question for that, because a lot of this is about how it fits in that categorization scheme. There are lots of bets that you'll do that will not require additional research. So the first thing is to nail down your categorization scheme. The next step, as you mentioned, is that usually if you can build that language as a team, it will become pretty obvious when it will be very valuable to reduce uncertainty about something. So one of my pet peeves, and you see this over and over with companies, is they just want a mono process for all their work. We will process all work this way. All work will go through these stage gates. All work will need this type of approval. All work will have 2 weeks of design thinking. All work will have spikes or whatever. The irony of that is anytime I've done this activity with the people, with the team that I just described you, they end up with like 15 shapes of work. Like there's no just one process of ways to do it. So back to a very practical example, you come up with the taxonomy of work, you figure out you have very little knowledge about that particular persona. You realize that the opportunity is potentially huge, but the solution space is wide open. Is it amenable to experimentation? Yes. Okay, good candidate to have a team try 6 things that'll fail to get the 7th thing that will work. You might not need certain research techniques. On the flip side, maybe it's not as experimentation friendly, it's a new persona, and there's questions about the size of the opportunity. That might be amenable to sending a designer and a tech lead and a PM together to go a little bit upstream and try to figure out details. So once you figure out the shapes of the work, you can start asking questions like, how should we stack our learning backlog? How should we prioritize and sequence the work? And it's really like, I think if you can take one thing away from this, there is no way that all the work in your company is amenable to one process.
Totally
No way.
fair. I think one of the attractive points about monoprocess or fewer methods is it's a little bit easier to monitor and measure and to say, is the throughput there, which isn't necessarily the best indicator to be focused on. So, when you find those organizations and you talk about categorization and you kind of you're widening the perspective tremendously. Like, how does that resonate 3 months, 6 months on, such that they can sense the progress and understand, is this working for us?
What it really is about shape-specific working agreements. And I'll give you an example. I did this 2 weeks ago with a smaller company, and they determined for one shape of work, it literally made sense for 3 or 4 people to have up to the senior level to have a daily stand-up about it. because it fit the shape of something that would benefit from that level of governance, if you want to use for lack of a better word. Now, there are other efforts where you're sort of chasing, you're sort of doing small incremental changes, and none of the changes take more than a week anyway. And you're improving, you're eking out the improvements of the UX of an existing product. You do not need that governance for that. In fact, you could leave a team like that alone for 90 days and not care. You know why? Because like, what's the risk if something's going to happen and they're cranking out stuff all the time? All the improvements are pretty small. And frankly, the governance for that could be like, hey, team, now, as much as I like outcome-driven development, for that example, they might say, hey, we endeavor to crank out 60 of these small UX changes. Cool. How are you going to prioritize them? Well, we're going to prioritize them with minimally viable research. And if we have a couple bits of customer research, we're going to do a little bit of usability testing, but most of these are going to take between 3 and 4 days. Great, go. So that's what I would give you. It's like, it's one, you bring up an amazing point, because product leaders get this wrong all the time. If you do not offer a model for governance, the business will give you a model for governance. So if you don't like come up with a smart model for governance that reflects creativity, reflects ingenuity, reflects the nature of the work, someone will come up with it for you. Now, I would extend that to engineering leaders. If you're a product leader and if you're like, you know what, I don't need to know story points. Like, that's not why we're doing this. Like, I have some efforts that we want to put a light amount of governance this way, and some efforts we want to do that. Engineering leader, don't feel you need to go through these process hoops just for me. I don't care. Like, use the measures like the DORA metrics or other things that are valuable for you, but don't feel you need to go to these performative hoops to please me. So I would leave that with people. If you don't come up with the good game, someone will come up with a worse game. So it's on you to come up with like a good game of governance that reflects the nature of the work.
Yeah, I don't ever think I've seen velocity and profitability correlated for what's going to come out.
But it does in some cases. That's the thing, is that especially on Twitter, there's like, no estimates or no velocity, or how could we ever do deadlines? There's 2 sayings I have connected with this. One, lead with the why, not the way. And also, don't back yourself into a corner with absolutist statements that some smart person on the business side could immediately refute in 2 seconds. Sometimes a deadline will matter. Example. Sometimes there's a situation where you need to catch up with a competitor so fast, and you're just going to have to ship a bunch of features that have already been like figured out in the world to get to a certain point. Not that that's my favorite, but I'm just saying sometimes it can happen. Sometimes, X. And so the why versus the way thing, instead of going in like, well, I read Teresa Torres's book, and therefore we're going to do continuous discovery with everything we do. I really like that book. I think that's a good thing to learn, but it might not be the right approach for everything. And you're selling the way, not the why. The why is we need to reduce uncertainty where it matters so that we can have impact for the business. And so that's just like something to think about as you're advocating for these techniques. It's like, no one cares about the name of the technique. Exactly. Sorry, it's something I'm pretty passionate about. I talk about this all the time. So
no, and it's the perfect lead in for the community book club that we're going to announce a little bit later. You're bringing a library of examples of all the toolkits we need to know to rise to the occasion. So we're talking about bets. Looking back on the last decade, curious about big bets you might have placed in the product management space, and if you could tell us a bit about how it turned out.
I'm going to use Amplitude. It's going to seem weird because you could say, well, your role is not really a product role right now. I think, but I think it is a good analogy. So one of the bigger ones is at Amplitude, just really leaning into this whole North Star framework thing that we're working on. And it seemed very irrational at the time that a company would invest like a lot of time in trying to become the best at the world at something, in the sense of becoming like the preeminent teacher to the world of those things. And though I will bring you one thing though about the beginning of it, is that it's something back to maybe how this played out in general, is that when we made that bet as a company, we were running workshops every day in the real world. So it didn't just come out of thin air. It was just, we were seeing the business results as a company. And so we started to basically build confidence in that particular bet that we're going to create this whole franchise. Like, it would seem unreasonable to a lot of people that they have one person like me go and do like 200 workshops to do something, but it's been phenomenally successful for the business. So it's not like it's not a juicy example, unfortunately, but it worked out pretty well. And in the beginning, I think the lesson that I learned from it is that it's one thing to do something as a company when it evolves from something that's working on the small than it is to try. So these types of workshops are working really well for Amplitude on the small. They weren't scaled yet, or we hadn't written some kind of playbook or anything, but every day we were working and doing these particular things. It was authentic. It helped people. We saw the results day in, day out. And then from there, we kept doubling down on it. And then we created something to do it. So I don't know. That's kind of a boring example. I can tell you about things that went really wrong, too. Yeah, I tried to do a real estate. It's not quite, it's more than 10 years ago, but right in the 2006 or 7, I had a startup that was going to attempt to factor real estate broker commissions in New York City. Because if you arrived in New York City and you decided to do real estate, which is a pretty accessible job, you could have like 50 to 100 to 150 or $200,000 owed to you in broker commissions, and it would take you 6 months to get there. And so seeing this particular opportunity, we started to like connect with Douglas Elliman. We started to connect with these people and said, what if we factor these commissions and take like 15% or a sizable amount of money? And I remember the day when someone says, sounds like a great business. The chance of real estate broker commissions not being paid is 0.00001%. And then, of course, the real estate, like then 2008 hit, and that number went completely haywire. So one lesson I learned from that is that any time your business, we were pretty young at the time, and we're like, this is great. This is like printing money. We'll get money from over here, and then we'll just sell all these broker commissions in like tranches of things, and then we'll get a commission. It'll be amazing. And the fundamental assumption was that 0.001% was going to stay like that, which obviously was a foregone conclusion. So yeah, always test your core assumptions. Another one is I had this bartending game that I made in the early 2000s that was published by Simon & Schuster. It's called Last Call. You can look at these funny videos on YouTube. It's really kind of goofy game, but you learn how to be a bartender. And still to this day, there's like a bar in Germany that runs a Win95 machine to continue to train its bartenders using Last Call. Again, the same problem. I had these like Tina Fey did voiceover for it when she was really early in her career. She did it under a stage name, and there's all these goofy New York people, but we made it really raunchy. And just when we were releasing it, Walmart like slapped the rating that you couldn't, like they couldn't sell it in the stores because, we had like abundant liquor and there's people having sex on the bar, and like there was always sort of like bad things. So I had a string of not really testing the fundamental assumptions for products for a while. So those are some older stories to do that.
Appreciate it, and love the connection between the bet, the entrepreneurial nature of that growth at Amplitude. And I mean, there's a tremendous amount for being engaged, having fun, and learning in the process, which I think is one of the privileges that we have as product managers, because it is such a dynamic role. The floor can fall out from under you, and in the real estate example and others. But we do have this imperative to help businesses grow, right? Like that is a big part of what we do. So how do you relate I don't know, the importance of product management in that mission? How do you tell that story as you're evangelizing product management?
Well, one thing to be clear is I think that there's some different worldviews baked into product management that we should acknowledge. And I say this too, because if you follow, like there's certain sort of Silicon Valley school of the role of product, and I would advise people to find, it's semi-related to your question, and then let's return to it too. that I've met people who fundamentally value the idea of being there with a team and succeeding together in a way that helps business and humans out in the world. Like that's their big thing. And I meet other people who are extremely entrepreneurial. Their idea is growing a product. That's what they like to do. And then there's also PMs who really love the intricacies of joining a product and kind of tweaking and experimenting. So they really like buy into that particular part of the thing. So before answering that, I think that it's important for folks to find their own North Star about why they're doing product, and don't necessarily believe you need to conform to a particular archetype. And I say a lot of the archetypes especially come out of Silicon Valley, you know, this like extreme high agency entrepreneurial, you know, framework wielding, model wielding person might not be the kind of person you are. And so I'll just leave that out there for a second, that I think that like part of this is kind of coming to grips with why you like product management, because I have met people who are a little later on in their career and they're just burnt out and they're trying to find what they loved about product again. And it's a really hard work in many ways. And there was a lot of ups and downs. So I know that I just pivoted off your question, but it reminded me of that. There's different views and work views, forget world views for a second, about why people enter product. And so you should consider that, I think is important.
Appreciate that. So
like let's even make it clear that there is a problem in product at the moment, that there are different schools. And so there are 23-year-olds who did a year at McKinsey or whatever, and are becoming a VP in like 3 years or 5 years in the Valley. And they never even really worked on a team. You know, they knew the gift of the gab, and they could do that. Now, I got started in product relatively late. I played music in my 20s and then did these weird businesses and stuff. So I'm 47 now at the moment and doing it. And, you know, it can seem daunting in this space because there feels like these certain archetypes that know the talk, that walk the walk, you know, that just, you know, can go on and on about bets and experiments and all your stuff like that. Don't let that discourage you necessarily, because there's like multiple ways to get and continue to be in this business. And there's not just one archetype of like the super slick Silicon Valley product manager that you need to conform to. That I would leave that for folks.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And just as much as each one of us has a different flavor and style of product management, so is each organization. The way that product management, what does product mean to that organization, and where are they in their product journey? So then perhaps some parting advice for you. So, you know, what steps do you think folks in the community could take in the coming months to increase their impact as product managers?
Yeah. The first thing I would say is to create an honest strategy, like we talked about. So I have to do this exercise. It's called FAB. It's facts, assumptions, beliefs. Things are going to be changing very rapidly in these months. And so the more, even with your particular team, you can walk into that meeting and say, facts are things that are incontrovertible. Assumptions are things that we assume to be true. There's assumptions, which are, there's a subcategory called operating assumptions, which we are operating under the assumption that X is true until proven otherwise. It's a little slightly different. And then beliefs are like the core beliefs. You could argue that those are assumptions, but beliefs take on a different characteristic. Beliefs are things that, of course, you could nod your head at, but they span so many years that they aren't even really stated as assumptions. It's like, let's say amplitude would be, there's 2 sea currents in the world. It's product and data. And we're on that wave, and we need to be at the right point on that wave to be successful. That's kind of an assumption, but it feels more belief-like, right? Like it's just a sort of, it's almost like quasi-religious to do those things. So I think that the one thing you could do for your particular team is to keep a catalog of your facts, assumptions, beliefs, and really try to get your PMs who work for you to do this too, which is every week or two, has anything changed in your picture? Has your confidence increased or decreased on any of your assumptions? Have we moved any assumptions to facts? Have any beliefs started to feel weaker to you? And what's your plan to grow the certainty where you need to grow the certainty? And then also, where must we just operate on blind faith? I know that sounds like a weird way to put it, but it's like, there's a concept called an enabling constraint, which is to make any progress in a complex space, we need to hold some things constant. Because if we don't, we're going to get spun around. And so when you think about an enabling constraint, it might be saying to your team, I am creating the meeting 6 months from now where we will have a beat down on this assumption for 6 hours. Now in advance. Until we hit that, we are operating under the assumption that that is true. Collect all the data you want over the next 6 months and come and rip this apart. I'm giving an expiration date on this operating assumption. We're going to operate under this for 3 months or 6 months and do that. So that's what I would leave for people as something I've been working with a lot of leaders on lately, which is, do you have your little one pager of fab there ready? Are you revisiting it every 2 weeks or whatever? Are you adapting it accordingly? Are you keeping a version history so you kind of see where it's gone over time? And then are you teaching the PMs who work for you these habits? You know, like, what are your operating assumptions? What are your enabling constraints? What are your facts? What are your assumptions? What are the core beliefs that we have? If you can do that and build these habits, I think are going to be what's helpful to get your team kind of absorbing the changes that are going to come up through these coming months to be able to do it.
So last question for you. I'm curious how much of this is like downside protection if things keep going a little bit harder, a little bit tenser. What if we were in that abundant growth part of the cycle? If we were on the upswing, would your advice be the same?
My advice would be the same, but arguably our ability to hold those discipline in the habit would be very highly tested realistically, because you'd be doing it in something it's like, oh, we're acquiring this company. You know, like the surprises, the sort of the growth thing would add. I think the aspiration is good. You should try to do it. Just realistically, I think that there would be different types of challenges to keeping that habit as we're doing that.
Fantastic. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. Yeah, my
We
pleasure.
greatly appreciate your time and having the opportunity to learn from you this evening.
Yeah, and so sorry. Thank you so much to Q4 for sponsoring this. I thought this might have been like a leftover from an event for like you were going to do Q4 planning or something. And so I did not mean to riff on the name of your company. I'm like super grateful. I've just been involved in the Q4 offsite planning. So it triggered me a little bit, but like I think I get it overall as a company. So yeah, I appreciate the sponsorship for doing that.
Brilliant. A big round of applause for John. Thank you so much. All right.
Cool.
We are going to wrap things up with just a couple quick announcements. So we have been working on our fall plan here. Matt LeMay in a similar format. Matt's in London, and he will join us, and we'll have an in-person component to the event. We're going to bring together in partnership with the Torchy community. Our November event will be a combination of product and design, talking with Iran Benari, Jeremy Bailey, and Tede Van Gelderen from bringing an agency perspective. And then the spring social experiment that we ran, like if we pour beer, will people show up to drink it, worked. So we were thinking we would try that again.
Is that a belief, assumption, or a fact?
It turned out to be all three. Brilliant. So let's see, we will community book club. So John, we would love to have you as an honorary member of the community. And for everyone else in TPMA, we're starting up the community book club. So one of our volunteers, Jenna, has introduced this. There is a poll in the community book club channel. So please jump in there and weigh in on what you would like to focus on in the quarter. Really nice format. Everyone reads the book, brings your own question, upvote on the questions to focus on to kind of crowdsource the club. And it's not a matter, it's not one of those like, I didn't read it, I'm going to show up and like actually engaging around the conversation. So would love to more conversation there. And as John was saying, there are so many different books, so many different methods for various moments. And I really like that dynamism in our role and having everything in its place at the right time. So Thank you again to John. We would love some feedback. So if you wouldn't mind scanning this QR code, and we'll also distribute it in the follow-up email. Really simple, just love to see how is this format, anything that we can do differently. And this is a community about you all, about us bringing together and learning. So the more feedback that we have, the better that we can tune it for everybody's interest and build it together. So one more round of applause for John this evening. Thank you all. And so for those online, we're going to say goodbye for now. And for those in the room, there's drinks and some nibbles and some time to network. Have a great evening, everyone.